$106 billion. That's what China poured into Venezuela between 2000 and 2023. Loans, infrastructure, oil deals, joint ventures, gone, all of it. And here's what should keep you up at night. This exact pattern has destroyed rising powers for 200 years. Not a similar pattern, the identical pattern, 4 stages, every single time. January 3rd, 2026, 2 in the morning, Caracas time. U.S. Delta Force operators breach a fortified compound in the heart of Venezuela's capital. 30 minutes later, President Nicolas Maduro is blindfolded on a helicopter heading for the USS Iwo Jima. Hours earlier. Hours. Maduro was shaking hands with China's top envoy to Latin America, smiling for photographs, thanking Xi Jinping for his brotherhood. That photograph is now evidence of the most expensive foreign policy failure in Chinese history. But here's what nobody is telling you. China walked into a trap that has been running for 2 centuries. Britain fell into it in 1825. France fell into it in 1890. Every rising power that challenges a hegemon in their own backyard learns the same lesson. And China just learned it with $100 billion, 4 stages, 1 outcome, 0 exceptions. Let me show you exactly how empires lose everything. This is not theory. This is not speculation. This is a pattern so consistent it might as well be mathematical law. 4 stages, every rising power, every unstable debtor, 200 years of exposed so-called sophisticated partnerships. Stage 1, the creditor's delusion, a rising power spot's opportunity, resource-rich nation, politically unstable, shut out of Western capital markets, desperate for cash. The rising power steps in with billions, not charity, strategy, geopolitical positioning, access to resources they need. They think they're protected because they're not lending cash. They're buying guaranteed future resources, oil, minerals, commodities. It looks like genius, feels like checkmate. It's the beginning of the end. Stage 2, the expansion trap, money flows, first loan disperses, then second, then third. Infrastructure projects launch, production targets get set. Except production never meets targets. The economy doesn't stabilize, and here's where the trap closes. The creditor can't stop lending. Stopping means admitting the first loans are worthless, that billions are gone, so they double down, restructure, extend terms, lower rates. They call it strategic patience. It's actually a refusal to recognizing losses. Stage 3, the breaking point. Something breaks, always does. Commodity prices collapse, political crisis erupts. External intervention happens. The debtor's economy shatters. They can't pay. Not won't. Can't. Mathematically impossible. The creditor demands payment, gets restructuring instead, accepts oil at massive discounts, marks it as repayment while real value evaporates daily. Stage 4, the inevitable transfer. This is how it always ends. The debtor collapses or gets overthrown. A new power steps in, usually the regional hegemon. They take the assets, the infrastructure, the resources, everything the original creditor built and paid for. And the creditor? They write angry statements, protest at the UN, demand international law be respected. They do everything except what matters. They don't enforce collection, can't use military power, accept the loss, and move on. Now let me prove this pattern is real. 3 historical examples, same 4 stages, same outcome, different centuries, different empires, identical results. 1822, Britain just defeated Napoleon, undisputed financial superpower of the world. London is drowning in capital, investors are hunting for returns. Enter Latin America, freshly independent from Spain, massive natural resources, unlimited potential. At least that's what everyone believed. The investment fever that followed was absolute madness. Between 1822 and 1825, British investors poured £20 million into Latin American sovereign bonds. Adjust for inflation, that's nearly £2 billion today. Colombia gets $6.75 million. Peru gets $1.8 million. Chile, Mexico, Brazil, everyone's getting funded. The London Stock Exchange is on fire. Mining companies forming overnight. Bond prices climbing. This is the future. This is where fortunes get made. Stage 1 complete. The creditor's delusion is total. Then the expansion kicks in. Not just government bonds anymore. Private mining ventures, railway schemes, infrastructure projects. British capital flooding South America. Returns look spectacular on paper. But production isn't meeting projections. The mines aren't producing. Infrastructure isn't getting built. Political instability is constant. Civil wars, coups, revolutions. The borrowers keep asking for extensions, keep restructuring terms, keep promising the turnaround is coming. Britain keeps lending. Why? Already in too deep. Stopping means admitting failure. Surely this is temporary. Surely things will stabilize. Surely the resources will start flowing. They never do. Stage 2. The expansion trap is closed. Then 1825 detonates. The London financial crisis erupts. Banking panic spreads across Europe. The speculative bubble bursts, everyone demands their money back. And Latin American borrowers? They can't pay. Gran Colombia defaults, then Peru, Mexico, Chile. Eventually, every major Latin American borrower except Brazil defaults. Default rate exceeds 68%. Investor losses range from 44 to 86%, depending on which country you backed. Colombia doesn't resolve its debt until 1845, 20 years later. Peru takes until 1849. Some investors never recover anything. Total British losses, roughly 15 to 18 million pounds. 75 to 90% of their investment vanished. Stage 3. The breaking point arrived exactly as the pattern dictates. Now watch stage 4. The defaults eventually get restructured at pennies on the pound. And who fills the vacuum? Other European powers, France, Germany, later the United States. They come in with new deals, new terms, new control. The British investors who funded Latin American independence left holding worthless paper. Their strategic investment in the region's future became someone else's opportunity. The empire that ruled the seas couldn't enforce repayment without wars they couldn't afford. The pattern held perfectly. Stage 1 through 4, exactly as described. 100% predictable. Zero enforcement. Complete transfer of assets to the next power. Now watch it happen again. Different century, different players, same outcome. Fast forward 60 years. 1880s. Different decade. Same pattern. Britain's still the dominant financial power, but now they're more sophisticated, more careful. They learned from the 1820s disasters. At least that's what they told themselves. This time they're investing in serious countries, real economies, places like Argentina. Argentina in the 1880s is booming. Railways, ports, agriculture. They call it the Paris of South America. British investors can't get enough. Between 1880 and 1889, Britain pours 150 million pounds into Argentine investments. Government bonds, railway companies, utility companies, everything. The prestigious Baring Brothers Bank leads the charge, one of the oldest and most respected financial institutions in Britain. They're underwriting massive bond issues, investing their own capital. This is the safest bet in emerging markets. Everyone knows it. Risk spreads are tiny, 300 to 500 basis points above British government bonds. Nothing for an emerging market. Argentina is solid. Stage 1. The creditor's delusion returns. Different country, same blindness. By 1889, British investment in Argentina represents 40% of all British overseas investment. 40%. In one country, they've expanded massively. New railways, new infrastructure, new loans to cover old loans. The Argentine government is spending without restraint, building a modern nation. British banks keep funding it. But here's what they're ignoring. Argentine revenues aren't growing as fast as debt. Infrastructure isn't generating projected returns. Political corruption is rampant. The government is using new loans to pay interest on old loans. Classic structure of a collapse waiting to happen. British banks see the warning signs. They see them clearly. But they're in too deep. Baring Brothers alone has 10 million pounds exposed. More than their entire capital base. More than everything they're worth. They can't stop now, can't admit the exposure. So they keep lending, keep restructuring, keep hoping something changes. Stage 2 complete. The trap is closed again. 1890. The crisis detonates. Global liquidity crunch. Commodity prices collapse. Argentine revenues crater. The government can't service debt. They default. Spectacularly. Baring Brothers faces immediate collapse. The Bank of England has to organize an emergency bailout. The crisis nearly takes down the entire British banking system. Triggers global financial panic. British investors lose 60 to 70 million pounds. 40 to 47% of their Argentine exposure. Just gone. The Argentine economy enters a decade-long depression. Currency collapses. Social unrest explodes. Government falls. Everything Britain tried to build. Shattered. Stage 3, the breaking point. Right on schedule. Argentina restructures its debt. Massive discounts. New government. New policies. And new foreign investors step in. American companies. German banks. They buy Argentine assets at fire sale prices. Negotiate better terms. Take the infrastructure the British built and profit from it. The British investors who financed Argentina's development, holding restructured bonds worth a fraction of face value. Their strategic investment in South America's future became someone else's profitable present. Stage 4 complete. The pattern repeats perfectly. 2 examples, 2 centuries, identical outcome. But I have one more, because you need to see this pattern isn't limited to one empire or one era. One more example. Because this one shows how hegemons deliberately exploit the pattern to displace rivals. Early 1900s. European powers, especially Britain and Germany, have massive investments across Latin America. Billions in today's money. Railways, ports, utilities, oil fields, debt obligations everywhere. These investments give them enormous influence. political leverage, economic control, strategic positioning in America's backyard. The United States doesn't like this at all. This is Monroe Doctrine territory. Latin America is supposed to be America's sphere of influence, but European creditors keep using gunboat diplomacy to collect debts, threatening military intervention, taking over customs houses, controlling key infrastructure. So America makes a move. Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. 1904. The message is explicit. We'll handle Latin American debt enforcement. Not you. Back off. This is our hemisphere. Europe gets the message, but they can't abandon billions in investments, so they stay. Keep lending. Keep hoping they can maintain position. Stage 1. America sets the strategic foundation for displacement. Through the 1910s and 1920s, the pattern accelerates. Every time a Latin American country faces debt crisis with European creditors, American banks step in. They offer refinancing, buy out European bonds, restructure debt, sometimes with State Department backing, sometimes with implied military threat. Venezuela defaults to European creditors. American oil companies get concessions. Mexico nationalizes European railways. American banks broker restructuring. Cuba can't pay British bondholders. The U.S. takes over customs revenue collection. Europeans protest, demand payment, threaten intervention. But they can't actually invade. Not with the U.S. Navy patrolling the Caribbean. Not with the geopolitical situation in Europe getting tense. They're overextended, unable to enforce claims. Exactly like Britain in the 1820s. Exactly like Baring Brothers with Argentina. Stage 2. European expansion is trapped. Then World War I detonates. European capital evaporates. Their economies shatter. Their ability to collect Latin American debts disappears completely. They're begging America for loans just to survive. How can they pressure Argentina when they owe Washington billions? By the 1920s and 1930s, Latin American defaults to European creditors are widespread. The Great Depression makes it catastrophic. Default rates exceed 80%. European bondholders lose everything. Their century of investment in Latin America wiped out. Stage 3. The breaking point arrives exactly on schedule. Now watch the transfer. American companies buy the assets. Standard Oil takes European petroleum concessions. United Fruit dominates Central American agriculture. American banks hold restructured debt. Infrastructure Europeans built, now American controlled. The Monroe Doctrine achieved through financial displacement what military conquest couldn't. European creditors lost their investments, lost their influence, lost their strategic position. America filled the vacuum completely. Stage 4. The transfer is complete. 3 different eras, 3 different empires, 3 different sets of borrowers. Same pattern, same 4 stages, same inevitable outcome. Every single time. Now watch China walk this exact path. Stage by stage, loss by loss, exactly as predicted. Now let's walk through China and Venezuela. Stage by stage, line by line. You tell me if this looks different from anything we just saw. Stage 1. The creditor's delusion. Mid-2000s. China's economy is exploding. They need oil desperately. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, 303 billion barrels. 17% of global total, more than Saudi Arabia. But Venezuela is shut out of Western capital. United States hostile. Europe cautious. Hugo Chavez is desperate for cash. China sees opportunity. Not just oil, geopolitical positioning, a foothold in America's backyard, a challenge to U.S. hegemony. Exactly like Britain saw newly independent Latin America in 1822, exactly like Baring Brothers saw Argentina in 1880. Same delusion, same strategic narrative, same blindness to fundamentals. The deals start flowing. 26, $2 billion, 227, $7 billion more, 209, another $8 billion. By 2010, total lending hits $27 billion. According to AidData, a research lab tracking Chinese finance, China provided Venezuela with $106 billion in loans, debt, and capital investments between 2000 and 2023. $106 billion. In one country, China Development Bank alone extended $60 billion in oil for credit programs. The collateral, future oil shipments. Venezuela would ship crude to Chinese companies at pre-agreed prices for decades. China thinks they're protected. Same delusion British investors had about Latin American mining rights. Same delusion Baring Brothers had about Argentine railway revenues. The collateral looks solid on paper, meaningless in reality. They set up joint ventures in the Orinoco Belt, world's richest heavy oil region. China National Petroleum Corporation piles in. Sinopec follows, billions invested. Project targets, 400,000 barrels per day production. This is the future. This is strategic genius. This is checkmate against American hegemony. The creditor's delusion is complete, exactly as the pattern dictates. Stage 2. The expansion trap closes. Problems start immediately. Venezuelan oil production doesn't meet targets. Not even close. When China started lending in 2006, Venezuela produced around 3 million barrels per day. By 2016, down to 2.4 million. By 2025, somewhere between 900,000 and 1.1 million barrels per day, less than 1% of global production, less than a third of 1970's peak. Production collapsed 70% while China kept lending. But China's already deep in. 60 billion from China Development Bank, another 46 billion in other loans and investments. They can't write it off, can't admit failure. So what do? Lend more. 2014, another billion to PDVSA, the state oil company, another 1.5 billion for working capital. 2015, they restructure 50 billion in existing loans. Easier terms, lower rates, extended timelines. Why? Because if they stop lending, Venezuela collapses completely. And if Venezuela collapses, China loses everything. So they're trapped. Exactly like Britain kept lending to Colombia in 1824. Exactly like Baring Brothers kept funding Argentina in 1889, throwing good money after bad, hoping production recovers, hoping government stabilizes, hoping anything changes. Venezuela's repayment gets restructured again and again. Since 2016, Venezuela has been in significant arrears on debt service. Negotiations focused on redefining payment terms, made more complex by U.S. sanctions, but really about managing a simple fact. Venezuela can't pay, will never be able to pay. Not at original terms, not at any terms that make economic sense. By late 2025, debt owed to China estimated between $10 and $19 billion. But here's what matters. They're being repaid in oil at massive discounts, 20 to 40% below market. Nominal repayment on paper. Actual value, maybe 50 to 60% of book value. China's buying around 463,000 barrels per day from Venezuela. Sounds significant. It's only 4 to 5% of China's total oil imports, barely registers. And it's heavy, sour crude nobody else wants. High sulfur, difficult to refine, bottom-tier commodity, the kind that trades at steep discounts even in normal markets. 2024, China eases repayment terms again, signs new investment protection treaty, reaffirms the all-weather strategic partnership. Foreign minister meets Maduro, pledges continued support, promises more cooperation. All the language you use when you're trapped, when you're pot committed, when walking away means admitting catastrophic failure. Meanwhile, Venezuela's trade with China dropped from $12 billion in 2015 to $6.4 billion in 2024, collapsing. But China keeps supporting, because $100 billion doesn't disappear from balance sheets without questions, because admitting loss means admitting strategic failure. The trap has closed, escape is impossible, exactly where Britain was, exactly where Baring Brothers was, exactly where the pattern puts every creditor who ignores fundamentals for strategy. Stage 3, the breaking point. This isn't history anymore. This is happening right now in real time as you're watching this. December 2025, the United States starts tightening the noose. Trump announces a blockade of Venezuelan ports, sanctions Venezuelan oil tankers, begins military strikes on vessels in the Caribbean, claiming they're trafficking drugs on behalf of Venezuela. 4 Chinese companies get sanctioned for shipping Venezuelan oil. Corniola, Ares Global Investment, Crepe Myrtle, Winky International, all cut off from the U.S. financial system. The message is clear. China's oil pipeline from Venezuela is being severed. Venezuela's broader debt situation is already catastrophic. Total external debt between $150 and $170 billion. In default on 16 sovereign bonds totaling $1.81 billion. Haven't paid a sovereign bond since September 2017. Debt to GDP ratio somewhere between 180 and 200%. Mathematically unsustainable. Impossible to service. The IMF estimates Venezuela's nominal GDP at roughly $82.8 billion. They owe more than twice what their entire economy produces in a year. China keeps hoping something changes, keeps restructuring, keeps accepting oil at 40% discounts and calling it repayment. Then January 2026 arrives. January 2nd. Maduro meets with Qiu, China's special envoy for Latin America. They pose for photographs at Miraflores Palace. Smiles, handshakes. Maduro thanks Xi Jinping for his continued brotherhood. He posts on social media, calls it a fraternal encounter, says it reaffirms the strong bonds of friendship between China and Venezuela, in good times and bad. Hours later. Hours. January 3rd, 2 a.m., Caracas time. Explosions rip through northern Venezuela. Low-flying aircraft sweep over the capital. 7 explosions heard across the city. Operation Absolute Resolve. Over 150 U.S. aircraft launch from 20 bases across the Western Hemisphere. F-22s, F-35s, F-A-18s, B-1 bombers, drones. The largest American military operation in Latin America in decades. The Joint Air Component dismantles Venezuelan air defense systems, knocks out electricity in the capital, clears a path for what comes next. Helicopters carrying Delta Force operators fly into Venezuela at 100 feet above the water, skimming the surface to avoid radar detection, protected by a fleet of fighters and bombers overhead. 1 a.m. Eastern Time, they reach Maduro's compound in Caracas, a heavily fortified military fortress, Trump later calls it. The military had rehearsed for months, built an exact replica of Maduro's residence, practiced breaching the steel doors until they could do it in seconds. When Delta Force enters, Maduro and his wife Celia Flores are taken completely by surprise. Maduro tries to escape into a steel safe room. Doesn't make it in time. 30 minutes. The entire assault takes 30 minutes. A firefight breaks out after Maduro is captured. A U.S. helicopter takes a hit, but remains flyable. No Americans killed. By 3:30 a.m. Eastern Time, U.S. forces are out of the country. Maduro and his wife are aboard helicopters heading for open water. They're transferred to the USS Iwo Jima. Trump posts a photograph on Truth Social. Maduro blindfolded, wearing a gray Nike sweatsuit, soundproof headphones, holding a plastic flotation collar. The caption? Nicolas Maduro on board the USS Iwo Jima. From there, Guantanamo Bay, then an FBI aircraft to New York. Federal charges. Narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation, weapons possession. The man China backed with $106 billion is now sitting in a Manhattan federal courtroom. China's response? The foreign ministry calls it deeply shocking. A serious violation of international law. Blatant use of force against a sovereign state. They demand Maduro's immediate release. At the United Nations, China's representative denounces unilateral bullying. Says the U.S. has placed its own power above multilateralism. Calls it a grave threat to peace and security in Latin America. Strong words. Angry statements, diplomatic protests. Nothing that actually recovers the money. Stage 3 complete. The breaking point has arrived, right on schedule, exactly as the pattern dictated. Now watch Stage 4 unfold. Stage 4, the inevitable transfer. This is happening in real time. We're watching the pattern complete exactly as it has for 2 centuries. Hours after the capture, Trump holds a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, flanked by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. His announcement is blunt. The United States will run Venezuela. His exact words, run it until a safe, proper, and judicious transition can happen. No timeline. No details on who leads the American effort, just control. Trump says American oil companies will go in, spend billions fixing infrastructure, and start making money for the country. Chevron already has permits to operate. They received special exemptions from sanctions back in October 2025. While Chinese companies were getting sanctioned, American companies were getting licenses. The positioning couldn't be more obvious. Venezuela's military announces it recognizes Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as acting leader. The Supreme Court appoints her interim president for 90 days. Madurismo without Maduro, some call it. But here's what matters. The Trump administration has demanded interim authorities remove official advisors, spies, and officials from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Everyone who found a warm welcome under Maduro is being shown the door. China's infrastructure investments? Vulnerable. Huawei and ZTE telecommunications equipment across Venezuela? Likely to be dismantled for national security reasons. Chinese joint ventures in the Orinoco Belt? Subject to renegotiation under the new government? All those carefully structured oil-for-loan agreements? Dead. The new Venezuelan government won't honor Maduro's deals. Why would they? The man who signed them is facing narco-terrorism charges in New York. And here's the twist. Trump says he'll keep oil flowing to current buyers, including China. But at what price? Market rates. No more sweetheart deals, no more guaranteed shipments, no more collateralized loans, just straight commerce. If China wants Venezuelan oil now, they buy it like everyone else, at market prices, in free competition, with no preferential treatment. The 10 to 19 billion Venezuela still owes China. Good luck collecting. China can try arbitration under the 2024 investment treaty they signed with Maduro. File claims with UNCITRAL. Pursue legal remedies through international courts. Good luck enforcing anything against a U.S.-backed government that just overthrew your ally. Good luck with international law when the hegemon controls the assets. Chinese state media is already spinning the narrative. Xi Jinping, former editor of the Global Times, writes that Venezuela will be more expensive than Afghanistan. Says Trump owns the Venezuela problem now. They're preparing public opinion for the loss, for the write-down, for admitting that $106 billion just evaporated. Beijing's official line, they regret putting too many eggs in one basket. Regret being too ready to believe their investments faced minimal risks under international law. That assessment comes from Chinese commentators themselves, published after officials finished their internal review. Best case scenario for China, they've successfully offloaded a failing asset. They can blame America, posture about sovereignty, turn this into anti-US propaganda, maybe get market rate oil going forward. That's the best case. Worst case? They get nothing. Zero. Debt restructured at pennies on the dollar, joint ventures nationalized or sold to American companies, 2 decades of investment yielding negative returns, strategic foothold in Latin America disappears completely. Either way, they lose. The Center for Strategic and International Studies put it plainly. The U.S. operation was a dramatic display of the emptiness of China's security guarantees. On existential questions of regime security, Beijing couldn't protect its closest Latin American partner. China condemned. China protested. China demanded. China did nothing that mattered. No military response, no naval vessels dispatched, no escalation risked, nothing except accepting the loss and moving on. Exactly like Britain in the 1820s. Exactly like European powers in the 1930s. Exactly like every creditor who couldn't enforce collection against a regional hegemon. The pattern is completing. Stage 4 in motion. The transfer happening before our eyes. And the worst part? Venezuela isn't the only domino. Venezuela isn't an isolated failure. It's a signal. A signal being received by every country that owes China money. And the message is clear. Chinese debt can be walked away from, without consequences, without enforcement, without any cost, except angry statements from Beijing. Right now, developing nations owe China at least $1.1 trillion in outstanding obligations. That's trillion with a T. And they're all watching Venezuela. Pakistan is watching. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor represents $62 billion in infrastructure projects. Guadar Port was supposed to be the next Dubai. Instead, it sits underutilized. Not enough shipping. Locals protesting because there aren't enough jobs. Beijing has put more than $60 billion into Pakistan. The returns have been terrible. Projects over budget, populations unhappy, Chinese workers doing Chinese construction that profits Chinese companies, while Pakistanis see nothing. Sri Lanka is watching. They already learned this lesson. In 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its $50 billion in external debt. China was the largest lender. The Hambantota port became the symbol of Belt and Road failure, a new international airport in Port City that failed to attract investors. When Sri Lanka couldn't pay, China took a 99-year lease on the port, debt for equity swap, strategic asset transferred. But here's what matters. Sri Lanka still defaulted, still walked away from obligations. The 99-year lease was damage control, not debt collection. Kenya is watching. Their Chinese-built standard gauge railway is now in debt and losing money. They call it the railway to nowhere. Construction was abandoned mid-project when Chinese funding dried up. The tracks literally end in the middle of a cornfield. In 2024, more than a dozen Kenyans were killed during nationwide protests against sweeping new taxes. Taxes imposed to repay foreign creditors. The chief presidential economic advisor posted on social media, salaries or default? Take your pick. Zambia is watching. They defaulted in 2020. China is their biggest creditor. Billions of dollars in infrastructure financing accelerated economic growth, but raised foreign interest payments so high there was nothing left. Government forced to cut spending on healthcare, social services, and subsidies to farmers. Kyrgyzstan is watching. Their debt to China represents 42% of external debt. Over $5.1 billion owed, primarily to China's Export-Import Bank. The economy is contracting. Commercial returns on Chinese-funded projects haven't materialized. Tajikistan is watching. Laos is watching. Mongolia is watching. Ecuador is watching. 22 Latin American countries participate in Belt and Road. The Venezuela strike just showed every single one that Chinese presence is vulnerable to American military power. The pattern isn't unique to Venezuela. It's universal across Chinese lending. Research shows 63% of sovereign debt crises are systemic. They cluster. Happen in waves, get triggered by global shocks, not local failures. China is about to learn that lesson across a dozen countries simultaneously. All at once, all demanding restructuring, all threatening default, all asking for easier terms, all watching what happened to Venezuela and doing the math. If the United States can capture China's closest Latin American ally, overthrow the government, and seize control of oil assets without China lifting a finger to stop it, what exactly is the value of Chinese partnership? What's the point of an all-weather strategic relationship if Beijing can't protect you when the weather turns? Belt and Road was supposed to be different. China's system was supposed to be superior. Their approach was supposed to create lasting partnerships immune to Western interference. Venezuela just proved none of that was true. The terms of Belt and Road financing were shielded from public view through strict non-disclosure agreements. The World Bank and IMF raised alarm bells for years. Now those alarms are ringing across 3 continents. A Beijing-based columnist wrote after Maduro's capture that China provided Venezuela with $60 billion in loans and still had $10 billion outstanding. The debt was supposed to be repaid with crude oil, 10,000 barrels a day shipped to China. Those shipments are now at risk. The drilling platforms are at risk. The upstream oil projects are at risk. Billions in infrastructure could be forced to halt. And Beijing's response? We'll continue economic cooperation regardless of political changes. Our investments are protected under domestic and international law. Protected by what? Statements, press releases, UN speeches? Sri Lanka taught borrowers that Chinese debt leads to asset seizures. Venezuela is teaching them something worse. Chinese debt can simply be erased when a bigger power decides to intervene. Pakistan is learning. Kenya is learning. Ecuador is learning. The 106 billion China lost in Venezuela is pocket change compared to what's coming if this pattern spreads. Now let me address the arguments forming in your head right now. The objections, the rationalizations, the reasons you think this time might be different. I've heard them all. They're always the same, and they're always wrong. Objection 1. This time is different because China and Venezuela have a strategic partnership. No, it isn't. Britain called their Latin American investments strategic partnerships for mutual development in 1822. Baring Brothers called their Argentine relationship a special partnership for mutual prosperity. Every creditor in history calls it partnership right up until the debtor defaults. The language changes, the outcome never does. China and Venezuela signed an all-weather strategic partnership in September 2023. That was 3 years into hyperinflation, 2 years into total economic collapse, 6 years into crippling U.S. sanctions. Some partnership, some weather. Hours before Maduro's capture, he was thanking Xi Jinping for brotherhood, posting photographs with China's envoy, reaffirming strong bonds of friendship. Hours later, he was blindfolded on a U.S. warship. Strategic partnerships don't change mathematics. Venezuela couldn't pay in 2015, couldn't pay in 2020, can't pay now. No amount of diplomatic language creates oil production from nothing. No amount of reaffirming cooperation makes $10 billion in bad debt recoverable. The all-weather partnership lasted exactly until the weather got serious. Objection 2. China is different because Belt and Road is a new model. No, it isn't. Britain had the empire, France had the colonial system, America had the Monroe Doctrine. Every rising power thinks their system is different, their approach superior, their relationship special. Never matters. Belt and Road is just new branding for the same thing empires have always done. Lending to strategic locations for geopolitical positioning, securing resource access through financial leverage, building infrastructure to project influence. The packaging changed, the pattern didn't, and Belt and Road is facing the exact same problems everywhere. Sri Lanka couldn't pay, handed over Hambantota port on a 99-year lease. Pakistan is restructuring, projects delayed, populations angry. Kenya is negotiating relief while their railway ends in a cornfield. Zambia defaulted. Laos is in trouble. Mongolia is struggling. The pattern isn't unique to Venezuela. It's universal across Chinese lending. In 2024, China's Ministry of Commerce quietly changed its overseas lending rules, made riskier projects less likely to get approved. Even Beijing is admitting the model doesn't work. China built its Latin American strategy on the premise that economic engagement would be protected by international legal order. Venezuela proved that premise was contingent on Washington's restraint. That restraint just ended. 22 countries in Latin America participate in Belt and Road. Every single one just watched the United States capture China's closest partner and take control of their oil. Every single one is recalculating. Panama has already withdrawn from Belt and Road. Honduras is considering restoring relations with Taiwan. Mexico approved tariff increases of up to 50% on Chinese imports. The model isn't different. The collapse is just happening faster. Objection 3. China can afford these losses because they're so rich. This is the weakest argument of all. China's economy is $18 trillion. What's $100 billion? Just write it off. Move on. Here's what $100 billion actually is. It's a signal, a precedent, a message to every Belt and Road borrower that China won't enforce repayment, that you can default without consequences, that all-weather strategic partnership doesn't actually guarantee anything when the Americans show up. You think Pakistan isn't doing the math right now? The $62 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor isn't taking notes? You think Kenya's government isn't looking at their railway to nowhere and wondering why they should keep paying? Every borrower is learning the same lesson. Chinese debt can be walked away from, and China can't afford that message spreading. According to the IMF, China's total social financing reached 309% of GDP in the first half of 2025. Over half of global debt to GDP increase since 2008 originated from China. They have their own financial vulnerabilities, their own property crisis, their own bad domestic debts. Chinese banks have limited capacity to take on new risks. The $1.1 trillion in overseas obligations isn't play money, it's exposure. And that exposure is now concentrated in countries watching Venezuela and reconsidering their options. Research shows nearly 60% of China's overseas loans are now held by countries in financial distress, versus 5% in 2010. China isn't too rich to care. China is too exposed to afford contagion. Every objection leads to the same place. The pattern holds. The outcome is predictable. The loss is inevitable. Britain learned it. France learned it. European powers learned it. Now China is learning it. With $106 billion, 4 stages, 200 years, 0 exceptions. The creditor's delusion, the expansion trap, the breaking point, the inevitable transfer. Britain learned it in 1825, lost 75 to 90% of everything they put into Latin America. Baring Brothers learned it in 1890, nearly collapsed the entire British banking system. European powers learned it by 1930, watched a century of investment transfer to American control. Now China, $106 billion, 2 decades of strategic positioning, an all-weather partnership that lasted until the first real storm, gone. All of it. And here's what should concern you about what happens next. On Chinese social media, the reaction to Maduro's capture wasn't grief, it was excitement. By Monday, after the operation, topics linked to Trump capturing Maduro had received over 650 million impressions on Weibo. 650 million. The discussion wasn't about Venezuela, it was about Taiwan. If the US can snatch a leader in their backyard, many asked, why can't China do the same? Chinese nationalists are calling Venezuela a blueprint, a template for how Beijing should resolve the Taiwan question. By force, without warning. In a single night, Taiwanese politicians dismissed the comparison. China is not the United States. Taiwan is not Venezuela. The military calculus is completely different. They're probably right. But the fact that hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens are even having this conversation tells you something important. The Venezuela operation didn't just expose China's weakness in Latin America, it created pressure for Beijing to demonstrate strength somewhere else. The pattern doesn't end with Venezuela, it accelerates. Pakistan, Kenya, Sri Lanka, Ecuador. Every Belt and Road borrower is recalculating their relationship with Beijing. Everyone is watching what the United States did and asking whether Chinese partnership is worth the paper it's printed on. China built a $1 trillion lending empire on the assumption that international law would protect their investments. That assumption died in Caracas on January 3rd. What comes next is unpredictable, but the pattern that got us here is absolute. Rising powers challenge hegemons in their backyard. They overextend. They get trapped. They lose everything, every single time. For 200 years, China isn't special. Belt and Road isn't different. Strategic partnerships don't change mathematics. The pattern holds. If you want to understand what's coming next, subscribe. Hit the notification bell, because the dominoes are falling and Venezuela was just the first. I'll see you in the next one.